In the final, gasping days of 1823, on the salt-scoured coast of Massachusetts, a carriage thundered away from a lonely manor, its wheels churning a furious mixture of mud and desperation. The horses, whipped to a frenzy, galloped as if fleeing. The devil himself. Inside, a physician of considerable repute, a Dr. Abernathy of Boston, was violently ill, retching into a silk handkerchief that was already stained with bile and terror. His colleague, a stern man named Jonathan Blackwood, whose family had once owned the very land they were now fleeing, stared blankly ahead, his face a mask of waxy, profound horror. He whispered the same phrase over and over, a desperate litany. Against a memory that was already burning itself onto his soul, it is not natural. It is not of God. An abomination. They were two of the three doctors who had been summoned to witness a supposed miracle at Blackwood Manor. They were the two who fled into the stormy night. The third, a younger man named Dr. Samuel Crow, remained behind. He stood frozen in the doorway of a second-floor bedchamber, unable to command his legs to run. The air was a suffocating cocktail of ozone, the cloying sweetness of sickroom chemicals, and something else. Something indescribably alien, metallic and sweet, like blood and blooming nightshade after a lightning strike. Before him, on a bed, draped in ruined velvet, lay Margaret Ashworth, and her condition was not merely horrific, or tragic, or diseased. It was impossible. It was a fundamental violation of the laws of flesh and bone, a luminous nightmare that once seen could never, ever be forgotten. The story of what happened to Margaret Ashworth doesn't begin in that room of cold, glowing horror. It begins months earlier, with a promise. A promise whispered in the hallowed, gaslit halls of Boston's medical elite and carried on the simmest to the isolated Ashworth estate, a place called Gryke. The Ashworths were a family of old, fading wealth, their names still respected, but their coffers running dry. Their legacy haunted by a peculiar malady they called the familial tremor. It was a progressive neurological disorder, a ghost in their nervous system that began as a faint, almost imperceptible tremble in the hands. Over years, it would creep up the arms, bringing a palsied, shuffling gait, until finally, it consumed the mind itself, leaving its victim a silent, locked-in prisoner within a quaking body. Margaret, at 24, had watched this cruel thief steal her mother piece by piece. Now it was consuming her father, a once-proud patriarch now confined to a wing of the house. His days a long, shuddering twilight. Margaret, fiercely intelligent and possessed of a defiant spirit, had just begun to feel its first phantom touch, a slight, uncontrollable shiver in her left hand when she held a teacup. A telltale sign that the family ghost had now come for her. Into this world of quiet, suffocating desperation stepped Dr. Alistair Finch. He was a physician of almost mythical stature, trained in Edinburgh and Vienna, with eyes that held the unnerving, silver-blue intensity of a zealot. He moved with a predator's grace, and when he spoke, his voice was a mesmerizing cadence of certainty. He didn't offer palliatives or treatments. He offered a cure, a permanent, revolutionary reversal of the body's decay, forged not in the timid, fumbling medicine of the day, but in a new radical science he called somatic alchemy. He promised to not just halt the tremor, but to burn it out, to rebuild the very pathways of life and make the flesh perfect and eternal. For Margaret and her father, he was not a doctor, he was a savior. Dr. Samuel Crow, our third physician, the one who did not flee, was a man forged by failure. 5 years prior, his younger sister, Elise, had been taken by consumption. He had been a medical student then, full of textbook knowledge and youthful arrogance. He'd sat by her bedside, watching helplessly as the disease hollowed her out. his poultices and tinctures as useless as prayers against a rising tide. That failure became the defining feature of his soul. It drove him to study with a relentless, desperate intensity, to believe that somewhere, just beyond the veil of current knowledge, lay a true answer, a key to lock the door against death itself. He was young, principled, and possessed a brilliant but rigidly conventional mind. In October of 1823, a letter arrived for him at his modest Boston practice. It was impossibly heavy, the parchment thick as card, the wax seal bearing an intricate crest of a serpent entwined around a crystal. It was from Dr. Alistair Finch himself. The letter was an invitation, a summons, written in elegant, forceful script that seemed to leap from the page. Finch wrote that he was on the cusp of a breakthrough that would render obsolete the timid, bleeding and leeching practices of our superstitious generation. He was gathering a small, elite cadre of visionaries at his private coastal research facility, the old Blackwood Manor, to witness the final stages of a procedure that would redefine human vitality. For Crow, a man haunted by the ghost of his sister, a man who secretly believed conventional medicine was a losing battle, the invitation was a sign from Providence. To be chosen by Finch, to be included in such a circle, was the honor of a lifetime. He packed his medical bag, his mind alight with visions of vanquished diseases and a new era of medicine, an era where no brother would have to watch his sister fade away. He had no idea he was traveling not toward a cure, but toward a conspiracy, a place where the sacred oath to do no harm had been grotesquely rewritten. The journey to Blackwood Manor was an exercise in theatrical isolation. The carriage Finch sent was opulent, but its windows were fitted with thick velvet curtains that could not be drawn, leaving Crow in a dim, swaying cocoon for hours. The road devolved from a well-trodden coastal route to a narrow, winding track, the air growing thick with the smell of salt and pine and wet decay. The manor itself was a fortress of secrets, perched on a granite cliff overlooking the churning, gray maw of the Atlantic. It was a Gothic beast of a house, its gables like sharpened teeth against the sky. Salt spray had eaten at the stone, giving it a pockmarked, diseased look, and a perpetual, clinging gloom seemed to sap the very color from the landscape. Inside, the air was unnaturally still and cold, heavy with the scent of iodine, alcohol, and that strange, unidentifiable fragrance, like charged air after a lightning strike. Crow was greeted not by servants, but by two silent, grim-faced men with the hard, watchful eyes of prison guards. They led him through cavernous, dust-sheeted halls to a vast library, where Dr. Finch and two other men sat before a roaring fire. Finch introduced them as members of his Lyceum of Somatic Inquiry. They weren't discussing patients, they were discussing philosophy with a terrifying fervor. Finch spoke of the human body as a flawed, primitive vessel, a cage of weeping, bleeding meat, doomed from its first breath to decay. He and his associates believed they had found the key to transcending it. They spoke of biocrystalline resonance, of purifying the flesh into its final, incorruptible form. It was the language of alchemists and mystics, not physicians. Crow, the pragmatist, felt a cold knot of dread tighten in his stomach. The promised medical breakthrough sounded less like science and more like a dark, forbidden sermon. And the men delivering it looked more like high priests than doctors the following day. Crow was brought to what Finch called the orrery. It was not a laboratory in any sense Crow understood. It was a cathedral of blasphemous science. The vast circular room was 2 stories high, with a domed ceiling painted with an unnerving alien star chart. Instead of simple beakers and saws, the space was filled with bizarre, intricate contraptions of brass and copper wire, humming glass tubes filled with shimmering, viscous fluids. and a massive central apparatus that looked like a brass spine, connected to a web of crystalline lenses. The air vibrated with a low, constant hum, a sound that resonated deep in Crow's bones. And in the center of the room, on a padded table, under a bright, focused gas lamp, was Margaret Ashworth. She was awake, her eyes wide and unnervingly calm, a placidity Crow recognized as the effect of a potent laudanum tincture. Her left arm, the one that once trembled so slightly, was strapped to a frame, exposed to the complex machinery. The skin was transformed, a faint, pearlescent lattice of shimmering. Geometric patterns glowed just beneath the surface, catching the light like crushed mother-of-pearl embedded in living flesh. Finch explained, with the hushed reverence of a man revealing a holy relic, that they were not merely stopping the tremor. They were replacing the flawed, decaying nervous tissue with a superior, crystalline structure of their own design, a conductive matrix that would be immune to disease, to age, to decay itself. He placed a hand on Crow's shoulder. "We are not healing, Doctor," Finch whispered, his voice electric with triumph. "We are evolving." Crow looked from the impossible, beautiful, horrifying pattern on Margaret's arm to the fanatical gleam in Finch's eyes, and for the first time in his life, felt a profound, soul-deep terror of medicine. Doubt, once planted in the fertile soil of a principled mind, grows into a suffocating, thorny vine. Crow could not sleep. The low, incessant humming from the orrery seemed to vibrate through the floorboards of his guest room, a constant reminder of the beautiful horror he had witnessed. He began to explore the manor at night, a ghost in a house of secrets. He told himself it was scientific curiosity, but he knew it was fear. In Finch's private study, a room of unnerving order, hidden beneath a false bottom in a heavy chest of anatomical drawings from Vesalius, he found it. It was a codex, a heavy book bound in a strange, supple leather that was cool and smooth to the touch of texture. He recognized with a sickening lurch as expertly tanned human skin. It was the private journal of the Lyceum of Somatic Inquiry. The entries were written in a precise, coded script, but Crow's classical education allowed him to slowly decipher the horrifying truth. This wasn't the first experiment. Margaret was not subject 1. She was subject 7. The codex detailed, with chilling clinical detachment, the fates of the previous 6 wanderers, debtors, and forgotten souls procured for the Lyceum's work. He forced himself to read, his hands trembling. Subject 3. A male vagrant of robust health. Initial transmutation of the respiratory system showed promise. However, cellular rejection at 72 hours led to catastrophic dermal dissolution. Flesh literally sloughed from bone. Fascinatingly, the crystalline structures remained intact. Body disposed of in the East Lime pit. A valuable lesson in protein compatibility. He felt bile rise in his throat. He read on. Subject 5. A young woman from the docks. Uncontrolled crystalline growth in the skeletal system resulted in total ossification within a fortnight. Subject became, in essence, a living statue. Inaudible humming was noted in the final days. A fascinating, if terminal, outcome. Her remains proved too dense to transport. She resides in the lower vault. They weren't curing a tremor. They were trying to build a new kind of human. And the first 6 attempts had ended in unimaginable agony and death. Their bodies dissolved, turned to stone, or simply discarded like failed pottery. Margaret's family tremor was just the perfect excuse, the perfect lure. The next afternoon, Crow contrived a reason to examine Margaret alone. Under the pretense of documenting the marvelous progress for his own notes, a task Finch heartily approved of. The 2 guards watched from the hallway, their faces impassive. He leaned close, checking her pulse, his mind racing. The laudanum haze seemed thicker today, but as he gently palpated her arm, he whispered, "Miss Ashworth, can you hear me? My name is Samuel Crow. I want to help you." For a moment, nothing. Then, the placid emptiness in her eyes cleared. A flicker of the old, intelligent Margaret returned, a drowning person breaking the surface for a final gasp of air. Her gaze was a raw scream of desperation. Her lips barely moved as she formed a single, terrifying word: hungry. He frowned, confused. "Have they not been feeding you?" She gave a minute shake of her head. "It's hungry," she whispered again, her eyes darting down to her own arm, where the crystalline lattice now seemed to pulse with a faint internal light, a rhythm out of sync with her own heartbeat. "It wants more." Her right hand, the one that wasn't strapped down, moved with surprising speed, pressing a tiny folded piece of paper into his palm as he adjusted her blanket. It was a page torn from a book of poetry, and in the margins, in a shaky, fading hand, she had written, "He calls it a cure. It is a cage. It sings to me in my sleep, a cold fire. He says I am the first. He lies, I hear the others. They are in the walls, God help me. It is growing." The door creaked open. Finch entered, smiling his serene, terrible smile. "Is our subject resting comfortably, Doctor?" The moment was over. But Crow now held the proof, a message from the abyss. He was no longer a witness, he was a co-conspirator in a battle. For what was left of a woman's soul, the change in Margaret began to accelerate with terrifying speed. What had started as a faint, beautiful shimmer on her arm began to spread like a frost pattern on a window pane, a slow, inexorable tide of transformation. Thin, silvery filaments were now visible beneath the translucent skin of her neck and cheek. At night, the guards reported that the low, resonant hum emanating from her room had grown louder, a palpable vibration that made their teeth ache and the water in a glass ripple. Most disturbingly, her body had begun to emit a faint, cold light of its own, a pale blue phosphorescence that waxed and waned with her breathing, turning her room into a ghostly lantern. She no longer spoke in words, but sometimes a soft, melodic chiming could be heard from her throat, as if her very vocal cords were turning to resonant crystal. Finch was ecstatic, his demeanor shifting from that of a scientist to a rapturous prophet. He would spend hours in her room, taking notes not on her health, but on the tonal qualities of the humming. He saw it as the final, glorious stage of transmutation, the flawed mortal flesh giving way to the perfect, eternal form. He declared the experiment a resounding success, a new dawn for humanity. It was time, he announced to the Lyceum, to unveil his creation. It was time to force the world to see the future. He sent urgent missives to two of Boston's most influential physicians, the aforementioned Dr. Abernathy and Dr. Blackwood, men whose endorsement would shatter the old paradigms and solidify his place in history. This brings us back to that final, fateful evening. The air in the manor was electric with Finch's triumphant anticipation. A storm was raging outside, throwing sheets of rain against the window panes, a perfect, dramatic backdrop for his revelation. Crow stood in the grand hall, a silent warden of a secret he could no longer bear, the weight of the codex entries and Margaret's note, a physical burden on his soul. Abernathy and Blackwood arrived, stamping the rain from their cloaks, their faces stern and skeptical, expecting to be shown some new surgical technique or a potent elixir. Finch, beaming like a proud father, greeted them with effusive charm. Leading them past the grim-faced guards and up the grand staircase, he spoke of vanquishing death, of freeing mankind from its biological prison. Abernathy scoffed quietly, whispering to Blackwood about Finch's well-known eccentricities. Finch threw open the door to Margaret's room. The chamber was deliberately kept dark, save for the ethereal, pulsing blue light radiating from the woman on the bed. The humming was louder now, a palpable vibration in the air that seemed to press in on them. Margaret lay still, her skin a living mosaic of pale flesh and glowing, crystalline structures that had now broken through the surface. In delicate, razor-sharp blossoms on her shoulders and hands. Her eyes were open, but they were no longer human. They were like geodes, multifaceted and reflecting the faint lamplight in 1,000 tiny, cold points of light. There was a choked gasp. It was Abernathy. He stumbled back, his hand flying to his mouth, his face contorting in disgust. Dr. Blackwood stared, his professional skepticism vaporizing into pure, primal fear. His family had founded this town, fought natives, tamed the wilderness, but he had never seen anything like this. Alistair. What have you done to her? He stammered. Finch's smile never wavered. I have perfected her, gentlemen. I have made her eternal. Blackwood's composure shattered. You have created an abomination. He roared, his voice trembling with a mixture of scientific revulsion and superstitious terror. He turned and fled, nearly knocking Crow over in his haste. Abernathy, after being sick in the hallway, followed close behind. The carriage thundered away into the night, leaving behind a profound, damning silence, broken only by the soft, chiming hum from Margaret's room. The failure of the presentation, the absolute rejection by his peers, shattered Finch's messianic.com. The serene mask fell away, revealing a creature of cold, reptilian fury. He turned on Crow, who had remained frozen in the hall, his eyes narrowed with a terrifying, lucid suspicion. You, he hissed, his voice dropping to a venomous whisper. You have the stink of doubt about you. You carry the judgment of the old world like a disease. He saw it all in Crow's face, the horror, the pity, the condemnation. He knew, instantly, that Crow was not a disciple, but a witness and a liability. Crow was confined to his room, a prisoner in the very place he had come to seek enlightenment. The 2 grim-faced guards were now posted permanently outside his door, their impassive expressions now seeming openly hostile. Escape seemed impossible. For 2 days, Crow was trapped in a state of psychological torment, the humming from Margaret's room a constant, maddening companion. He ate nothing, pacing his cage, his mind a whirlwind of fear and guilt. He watched the manor's routines, noted the changing of the guards, the delivery of meals, the scent of chemicals from the lab. He began to plan, not with the hope of a hero, but with the desperation of a cornered animal. He would use Finch's own monstrous science against him. He recalled the codex entry for Subject 2, who had a violent, explosive, allergic reaction to a compound derived from iodine, a chemical he knew was kept in vast quantities in the orrery for sterilization. He would have to fake it, a performance for his life. On the 3rd night, as the guards brought his untouched dinner tray, he enacted his desperate gambit. He had spent hours meticulously fraying the wick of his oil lamp, complaining of a severe chill and asking for the fire to be lit. He waited for the guard to turn his back. He accidentally knocked the lamp from his bedside table. It shattered, the oil igniting instantly on the dry wooden floor. In the ensuing chaos of smoke and shouting, Crow crammed a piece of soap into his mouth to begin frothing, and then collapsed, thrashing on the floor, mimicking the violent, choking convulsions of anaphylaxis, a spectacle he knew Finch, the obsessive clinician, wouldn't be able to resist observing firsthand. It was the only way to get him in the room and create the diversion he needed. The ploy worked. Finch burst into the room, his scientific curiosity momentarily overriding his anger, barking orders for water and restraints. As he and one guard knelt to examine the seizing Crow, the second guard, distracted by the spreading fire, Crow made his move. With a surge of adrenaline, he lunged, not at Finch, but at the tall window overlooking the cliff face. He used a heavy porcelain water pitcher to shatter the thick glass. The sound lost in the crackle of the fire and the howling of the storm. He scrambled out onto a narrow, slick stone ledge, the cold night air and the roar of the ocean 100 feet below, a shocking, terrifying slap to his senses. He didn't look back. He ran, half crawling along the treacherous ledge toward a thick, ancient latticework of ivy he'd noted days before. His only prayer of a path down the cliff. The stone cut his hands and bare feet, but he barely felt the pain. He had the codex. Paige and Margaret's desperate note tucked safely inside his shirt, a testament against the madness he was leaving behind. He knew he couldn't go to the local constabulary. Finch was too wealthy, too connected. The story of a glowing, crystalline woman would be dismissed as the ravings of a lunatic. To fight a monster like Finch, a man who operated outside the laws of man and nature, you needed another monster. He remembered a name from Finch's private correspondence, a rival mentioned with particular, seething venom, Magistrate Thaddeus Thorne of Boston, a man of immense power, of old, untouchable money, known for his brutal ruthlessness and his deep-seated hatred of anything that threatened the established, predictable order of his world. Crow knew he had to offer Thorne something more valuable than justice. He had to offer him the complete and total ruin of his enemy. After a harrowing journey, traveling only by night, Crow, disheveled, exhausted, and smelling of smoke, secured a meeting with Magistrate Thorne. The magistrate's Boston study was a tomb of power, silent and dark, reeking of old leather, expensive tobacco, and generations of unchallenged authority. Crow didn't begin with a plea for Margaret. He began with a threat to the social order. He laid out the evidence with the cold precision of a surgeon, framing Finch not as a murderer, but as a heretic against nature and, more importantly, against the stability that men like Thorne cherished above all else. He described a rogue philosopher king on the coast, creating unnatural beings, creatures of unknown power and potential, an affront to God and a direct challenge to the predictable hierarchy of man. He showed Thorne the codex page, not as a record of murder, but as a formula for chaos, a blueprint for a new, unstable form of life. Thorne, a man whose face seemed carved from unyielding granite, listened without a flicker of emotion. He examined the evidence, his thick fingers drumming a slow, deliberate rhythm on his mahogany desk. He wasn't moved by the horror of Margaret's fate. He was intrigued by the opportunity it presented. Finch's Lyceum was new money, a faction of radical, arrogant upstarts. Thorne saw a chance to surgically remove a rival, absorb his wealth, and put an end to his dangerous, unpredictable philosophy. This Lyceum and its ... work will be excised, Thorne said, his voice a low, gravelly growl. Quietly, there will be no public scandal. The woman. She is a loose end, a piece of evidence that cannot be allowed to speak. She must be secured. The deal was struck in the shadows of the study. Justice would not be served. It would be bartered. A way for power and stability, the end of Blackwood Manor came not with a crash of law, but with the whisper of a blade in the night. There was no official raid, no nine-form constables. One night, a dozen of Thorne's men, hand-picked for their discretion and brutality, descended on the estate. They were not lawmen. They were predators, moving through the storm-swept grounds like wraiths. The Lyceum's guards were overcome with silent, professional violence, their bodies vanishing into the darkness. The orrery, the cathedral of blasphemous science, was systematically dismantled. Its bizarre contents were smashed with doused in oil and set ablaze. The fire carefully contained within the stone walls until nothing remained but scorched metal and melted glass. The ashes were then dumped into the deep, unforgiving waters of the Atlantic. The codex, the source of all the horror, was handed to Thorn, who likely took great pleasure in burning it himself. Page by page, erasing Finch's legacy from the world. Of Dr. Alistair Finch and his inner circle, no trace was ever found. No bodies were recovered. No charges were ever filed. They simply vanished, wiped from the ledger of the world as if they had never been. But Thorn's men found Margaret. She was in a hidden, lined room in the wine cellar, a chamber designed to contain her strange energy. She was calm, silent, and glowing softly in the oppressive darkness. A living artifact of a forbidden science, a secret that could never be allowed to see the light of day. For the sake of public order and Thorn's own secrecy, Margaret Ashworth had to disappear forever. Dr. Crow, his soul heavy with the leaden weight of his compromise, was forced to oversee the arrangement. It was the price of his own life and the end of the Lyceum. She was taken under the cover of a moonless night to a private, high-walled sanatorium deep in the Berkshire Mountains, a place for the inconvenient, embarrassing relatives of the wealthy. Her name was changed to Jane Doe. Her history was erased. The admitting physician, on Thorn's payroll, officially recorded her condition as a rare and incurable form of dermal phosphorescence, a fiction to satisfy any future inquiry. Crow visited her once, and only once, a year later. It was a pilgrimage of guilt. He found her sitting in a walled garden, her hands folded in her lap. The crystalline structures had softened, their sharp edges worn smooth, giving her skin the appearance of being carved from luminous, flawed marble. She was tragically, ethereally beautiful, and she was no longer human. She seemed to recognize him. She looked at him, not with fear or anger, but with a strange, detached serenity. For the first time, he heard her voice, not a whisper, but a clear, melodic tone, like the soft chiming of distant bells. "It is quiet now," she said, looking at her own softly glowing hands. "The hunger is gone." Crow left the sanatorium that day with a hole in his soul, and he never returned. He abandoned his ambitions, moved to a small rural town in Vermont, and practiced a quiet, humble form of medicine for the rest of his life, forever haunted by the eternal, glowing girl he had helped to save and helped to entomb. The Lyceum of Somatic Inquiry was never truly destroyed. A body with a head like Finch's always has other limbs. It was merely pruned, its most audacious branch severed. Did its other members scatter, taking their unholy knowledge, their codices, and formulas with them? Do other, similar sealed rooms exist today, hidden in the basements of corporate labs or the private estates of the powerful, where men of ambition and vision pursue human perfection at any cost? The story of Margaret Ashworth is a testament to the terrifying bargains made in the shadows, where justice is a commodity and human life is merely raw material for a grand, terrible experiment. Her fate poses a deeply unsettling question. Was her entombment a final act of cruelty, or was it a twisted act of mercy, a protection for a world that could never understand what she had become, and a protection for her against a world that would surely seek to dissect, study, and destroy her? We are left with the chilling realization that the greatest horrors are often not the work of lone madmen, but of organized, intelligent, and powerful groups who believe they are acting for the greater good. They write their own moral code, and the rest of us, in their eyes, are simply subjects. What would you have done if you knew? Leave your answer below. Subscribe to The Sealed Room, where every locked door eventually opens.